So the next year they did do the horror of Dracula. I think it was just called Dracula in Britain, but it was the horror of Dracula in the US. And now we had Christopher Lee in one of his most iconic roles ever as the Count Dracula, and Peter Cushing in one of his most iconic roles. I'd say people probably know him better. Well, I don't know. I can't speak for the time period back then, but I certainly run into more people who know him better as Van Halen. Van Halen. That'd be awesome. Van Halen fights Dracula. Van Helsing, know him better as Van Helsing than they do him as Frankenstein, because he's just such an iconic Van Helsing. Peter Cushing makes Van Helsing like a Robin Hood or a swashbuckling hero. He's a very physical Van Helsing. Long before Hugh Jackman in that movie ever tried to do anything like that, Peter Cushing was dashing over tabletops and ripping down curtains, and that iconic in the end where he grabs the two candlesticks and makes a cross out of them, and he's like, almost fencing with Dracula but holding up a cross. Peter Cushing is an amazing Van Helsing, really great, and he continues in a lot of those movies after that as Van Helsing as well. Christopher Lee's a fantastic Dracula. What I liked about this, again, Horror of Dracula, they didn't try to copy Universal, because you can't copy Universal. Those classic Universal movies, you can't ever touch them again. They're so wonderful. Even for all their flaws, they just tapped into such a pure magic, and it'd be folly for anybody to try to redo that. So Hammer knew that, whether it was because of their budget constraints or the rights or whatever, they tried a different track. And it'd be a really great paper for like one of my students if they ever wanted to do this, if I ever taught like a monster class again or ghost story class again, to juxtapose the first reveal scene of Dracula in the 1930 Universal or 1931 or whatever it was, Universal, with Bela Lugosi, that really great shot where he's standing on the stairs and he's got his cape open, and Carl Freund's camera sort of zooms into him. Really great shot. Juxtapose that with your Dracula reveal shot in Horror of Dracula, where Jonathan Harker's just walked into the castle and he looks up, and you've got Dracula, Christopher Lee's Dracula, on the top of the steps. So again, same stairway scene, but Dracula walks down the steps, and he walks in a way in such that his carriage, his posture remains still while his feet are, so he's not floating, but it's just this, it's a very powerful character coming at you. You realize that. And he's, got that deep voice, Mr. Harker, and he's whoosh, just kind of comes right at you, I am Dracula. You are welcome here, and that's great. They made the conscious decision in these movies, and I don't know why. I think it might have been so they didn't have to worry about a lot of special effects, but they made a conscious decision in the Hammer vampire movies to not do so much of the supernatural stuff like shape-shifting into bats and wolves and mist and all of that. He's still a vampire. He's still mortally afraid of crucifixes. Sunlight kills him. Garlic still works. All of that. It's still the vampire. Has to stay in a coffin by day. His bite will infect you with vampirism if he, wants to turn you and so forth, but not kill you or whatever. So it's still all the vampire trappings, but they took away the bat and the wolf and a lot of things from the novel. What they did add, though, of course, the Horror of Dracula, the Hammer horror movies are, I think, the first Dracula movies we ever see with actual fangs and actual bites, fangs going into the flesh and so forth, which is a big part of the story from the novel. It's a big part of the phallic, undertones of the story. We didn't see those in the Universal. You would see Bela Lugosi with that sinister face kind of go to a woman's neck, but then that was, it's cut from there. You don't actually see fangs. And likewise, you'd see like Mina, do the same thing to Jonathan, and when she's affected or whatever. So part of it is just it's in Technicolor. They actually used red blood. It's the first time you actually saw red blood. In fact, the iconic opening scene of Horror of Dracula is the tomb of Dracula, or the coffin there with the word Dracula on it, and it's playing the music, the theme, and towards the end of the theme, the splatter of red blood hits the name, which you can see as red paint. But it's the first, it was just it's in the 50s. It's 20 years or so after they made the first ones in Universal. They're able to do a lot more censor wise and technology wise, and it's in Technicolor too. So it's really cool, and I love I love the vampire movies, the Hammer vampire movies. I've got less problems with those, the ones that came after that, than I did with some of the Frankenstein ones. But like I said, we'll talk about those to come more next week. But the you really did see the sex appeal of the character ramps up. Now, some of it's too because it's a movie in the 50s versus watching a movie that was made in the 30s. Because there's a lot of sex appeal in Dracula in the 30s movie too, if you understand the culture and the time it was made and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, Dracula, the way he takes these women and goes into their neck and stuff, but this just ramps it up. This and it's nothing like it's not nudity, it's no softcore like some of the Hammer horror films later is like, okay, that's a lot of boobs, But these were the ones that first made in the late 50s there, so it's none of that. It's just all in the story and in the acting. Like when man, when Christopher Lee is Dracula, when he goes after Mina or Lucy, I forget which one, but you both all of them, any woman he's coming after, she's infected or she's enamored with him, so she's opening the window and she's laying on the bed, and it's just very much like a woman eagerly awaiting her lover, and she's exposing her neck, and I mean it's you got that theme, and then he shows up, and the way he like grabs her head, and then there's this look on his face, and the way he has the fangs, and he dives into it's just much more that kind of underlying eroticism, that's in the story anyway. You really see it a little bit more palpable in these movies compared to what had come before. Obviously, they took that crazy links, in movies that came later. But this was the first time anybody was seeing anything like that. So it's no wonder that kids were going to see these movies because they knew these monsters from the Universal monsters that had become very safe for kids. And they were going to see these movies with their parents, who probably knew these, characters too. And all of a sudden, this is like ramped up big time. For the late 50s, this was some seriously scary stuff, And it's no wonder that these movies just made such a huge impact on audiences and on the characters' portrayals to come, after that. I mean, it's a big deal. And we're definitely going to talk about the rest of Hammer horror movies. One thing I don't have time to talk about tonight that we'll probably open with next week is their take on the Jekyll / Wolfman. The first one they did was Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, which is really fascinating. Christopher Lee's in that too. It does a great job. We're going to talk about that next week, but then of course they ended up doing Curse of the Werewolf, which I've mentioned before, but we're really going to delve into that a bit too, because it's to my knowledge, the only adaptation that we've ever seen of Werewolf of Paris by what's his name? I've talked about him a lot though, but I did a whole review of the novel, so we'll talk about those a lot next week in the Jekyll and Hyde Wolfman attempts and pushes to mold that character as well. We'll keep looking at that, but they're mainly known for, of course, the Frankenstein and Dracula, and rightly so. These movies are just wonderful. They did wonderful versions of the Mummy. Can't leave those out. And of course, they did a lot of great films that weren't necessarily the iconic monsters, but were great films. They did the Gorgon, The Devil Rides Out. A lot of those kinds of horror films as well, but just didn't deal with any of the iconic, monster movies. Again, we're only scratching the surface because I just wanted to talk about the big boom, the impact the first films made. We're going to talk more about them as we look at the evolutions of the characters in the films as they went after what the characters and what the movies kind of continuously seeped into the mythos and to the icons before they were over and before more people started taking on the characters and so forth. But it's a big important era, so I wanted to at least break into it tonight, and then we'll get to further incarnations of it in the Hammer universe next week. But good stuff. And it ends with a big bang too, like with Dracula AD and all that kind of stuff. Good, a lot of great movies to come. Even a lot of good Super Frankenstein movies to come. Even though I've got some issues with some of the sequels and some critiques, I don't think they're all crap. And there were some really good ones to come too. David Prowse ended up playing the creature at some point as the Hammer horrors cycle continued. And he played it in 2 movies, actually. The great David Prowse, Darth Vader, Superman's trainer, Leah Plus says, I love that Lee gave Dracula some sex appeal, not just evil, ugly monster. A vampire is a sensual creature. It's a good point. And there was sex appeal to be had in Lugosi's character as well. This dapper man, this dapper foreigner in a tuxedo coming into these young women's bedrooms, but that was very much a sex appeal of the 30s. It didn't translate anymore by the time you're in your late 50s. And to us in 2025, we can see it a lot better in Hammers than we could in Bela Lugosi's. But part of it too is that Dracula wasn't a foreigner anymore in the Hammer films. He's just an Englishman, at least as the way he speaks, as the way he talks. Van Helsing himself is just an Englishman, we don't have this foreign aspect to the characters anymore. From like the old world Europe, that's something about both Frankenstein and Dracula that was a part of their books, part of their mythos. Certainly when they started being translated into Hollywood, that's part of the mystery of them, and Hammer Horror just decided, damn, we're gonna worry about that, and so it something's lost, but something's gained too. As you said, you get that um a lot of different aspects of the characters that come through. So I think that's part of what helps Peter Cushing do the more swashbuckling thing, because he's not worrying about doing a foreign accent to him, or playing it a different way or whatever. And I think that's part of what gives Dracula more of the translatable sex appeal to like modern audiences in that as well.